right. I mean, okay, so we've already identified, right? I mean, going back to Bernays and the Creel Commission, propaganda, being waged, at the American people, and then you've got stuff like Operation Mockingbird, right, which I believe was, let's say, around the 70s or something like that. Okay, so I mean, there's plenty of examples of, right, psyops being perpetrated against the American people, prior to Aquino's Mind War or the IIA program. What the IIA program does, as you sort of suggest, is what it does do is uh, it's basically making it about as explicit and overt as possible, right? Whereas something like Operation Mockingbird, right, wasn't really like publicly known, while it was operational, right? At least not right, in the early phases, anyways. Okay, um, and so this sort of is, like you said, a little more pernicious because it's like we don't even have to hide it, like we'll basically tell you we're going to do it to you.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. We are online at what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find the link to our blog in the episode notes. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode with anyone you can. My name is Andy Lipson. I'm a teacher in Oakland and socialist. We're joined, as always, by Kenny Zepeda, and Jessica and Eduardo will not be here. They're going to different parts of the country, and Jessica's doing something, and Eduardo, I think, is doing something in Mexico. So they'll be back next week. But we are joined by somebody who we haven't seen in a while, Jake Klyczek. He's been a regular here on What's Left, and he's written a book you can see behind him there behind his right-hand shoulder, a School World Order, which really it's the way I got to meet Jake, and talked about the technocratic takeover of education and how that was being used to launch a technocratic takeover of the world, of the globe. And he's a regular contributor to Unlimited Hangout and other things as well. So, Jake, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, as always.
So today's episode is something that actually is something me and Jake have talked about a number of times in different ways. We're kind of, what I hope to talk about is information. Is what information, how do we get information? We know there are so many lies told to us. And how do we figure out the truth? And then what often, I was talking to Jake about this, and I've mentioned this to Kenny, I feel like we often get caught up in, once we find that person who can tell us the truth, I feel like we do often get hung up on, let's find that one person or find that one resource that's going to make things truthful for us. And it's understandable because we are in a world of PSYOPs, controlled opposition, limited hangouts, which are terms we want to talk a little bit more in depth about. In all honesty, Jake, this is something that I feel like I've learned more about from you. So this is why I'm glad we're talking with you about it. And ultimately, we hope to discuss, how do we make our way in a world full of lies? How do we figure out, what do we believe? And how do we figure out who to trust? So I think that's the discussion we're going to have today. And maybe I'll just pitch it over to Kenny and see if he wants to add anything or put a spin on that right now before we get started.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important topic because, you do have to pause and see, where you stand and why and where you're gathering your information. Personally, I tend to, What's Left is a good spot for me, to discuss things and to expose some of my ideas and see if, they make sense. They make sense at explaining the world. And it is absolutely difficult to sort through all the stuff that we're being bombarded with. Obviously, through the last 2 years, we've learned a lot, about coverage, media information, how it's manipulated. And often, even where you have this dichotomy of sides, like I learned that lesson when I was involved in Nicaragua. That's how I got involved with this show, that there were two sides of the story, but they were both exaggerating. in their own ways for their own purposes, and so truth was hard to find, and that was a hard lesson that I had to learn back then. And I had to be honest. And like, again, what's left is a space for me to be honest. So that's one way that I think. But obviously there are big forces at play, that we're battling constantly. When you're doing your own investigation, research for your own, being. And so I am curious as to, the process, the ways that you guys deal with this, and it's speaking honestly and candidly about it, because I think that's important for people to know.
So, Jake, maybe you can kick this off for us, because I think all of us, me, Kenny, and you, all agree that the mainstream media is full of lies. We may disagree about where the lie is and what the truth behind it is, but we all know we're being lied to. But there are these things that make it sometimes difficult to then find out, okay, what's the truth behind it? And that gets us into these things of like controlled opposition, limited hangouts, and remind me of the other one. PSYOPs, right? Maybe, Jake, it would be good to start with defining some of these things that are actually, they really exist. We believe they really exist, and define what they are and maybe give some examples of them.
Yeah.
And which one do you want to start with, Jake?
I think the easiest way is just to start with what is a psychological operation, and then we can describe a limited hangout and a controlled opposition as a type of PSYOP.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, go ahead.
Me?
Yep.
Okay. Okay.
Well, because I mean, all honesty, Jake, I'm not saying I never heard of these things before, but it's in my conversations with you where it became clearest that these were pieces of dealing with the information warfare or finding information. And I became convinced that that this wasn't just a narrow sliver of something you're dealing with, but it was these things were penetrating all layers of the information architecture that we are faced with. And so that's why I want you to start talking about it, because in many ways, you're the one who introduced many of these terms in depth to me.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, so we have a few historical precedents. So before I get into defining what is a psychological operation, I think anybody probably watching this show is probably familiar with COINTELPRO in this, the counterculture era of the 60s and the 70s, right? Counterintelligence program. The Black Panther Party was infiltrated on record, right? A lot of those documents have been declassified. And then, related to COINTELPRO is another term that probably a lot of your audience is familiar with, and that's what's known as an agent provocateur, right? And so an agent provocateur is usually someone that's going to, through something like COINTELPRO, infiltrate an organization and then radicalize that organization or commit radicalized acts in association with that organization in order to get that organization demonized or painted in an unfavorable way that gets the public to disassociate. And often, in the case of like the Black Panther Party, eventually people were wrongfully jailed as a result of some of this stuff, right? And the Black Panther Party talked a lot about how we really wanted to emphasize our breakfast programs and our healthcare programs and our community organizing, but what the media always wanted to hype was we've got guns, basically, right? And then and then in many ways that was other stuff like Weather Underground and things, the Days of Rage, right? Basically these riots that basically were associated with all those countercultural movements. And then therefore, sort of it gets demonized and then provides the impetus to, raid and arrest and et cetera.
Yeah.
Okay. So you had your finger up like you wanted to.
No, that's just the point I wanted to raise also, is that these became not just the pretext for having the public think poorly of these things, but it became the pretext for state intervention on these organizations.
Yeah. Okay. And so the term, here's a series of books here. All right. So we got it's the 3 volumes. This is Mind War. Oh, that's the 3rd one. This is Mind Star. And this is Find Far. Okay, these are all written by Michael Aquino. Okay, and if people don't know who that guy is, he's an infamous figure in what's pejoratively called conspiracy lore or research. Okay, he comes up with this idea of mind war. This book is published. Let's see. So the white paper that becomes this series of books was written in the 1980s, was commissioned to be written in the 1970s, and it was written by this guy here. Okay, and there's his credentials. Okay, Michael Aquino, Lieutenant Colonel, Psychological Operations. Okay, he also was an acolyte of Anton LaVey. Okay, who founded the Church of Satan, and Michael Aquino later broke away from LaVey and he formed his own satanic temple known as the Temple of Set. Okay, and these are just they might become relevant. Like those details might become relevant as we discuss more. Okay, and so let me just read you the premise of this book. Okay, so it says on the premise that war is endemic to the human disposition, Mind War proposes to supersede its killing and destruction with a more civilized focus on the mind. The persons and property of humans are replaced as targets by the divisive situations and perceptions. These are then analyzed and adjusted to a practical consensus. Mind War extends to socio-political applications generally, identifying and refining previously vague or unknown mental processes into a new science of quote-unquote thought architecture. So for him, he says this new science of thought architecture is a standard of rationality and precision in human affairs in which the experience and exercise of thought are finally fully mature. Okay, and so basically, this whole book is about how to replace physical warfare with mind war. Okay, and mind war is his term for psychological operation.
And Jake, this guy, Mike Aquino, is he a person who's exposing PSYOPs, or is he a person who's been in the business of doing PSYOPs and then later it was like, I want to write about it?
Yeah, no. This is like a how-to manual.
Oh, okay.
Okay, like so his job in the military was to perform psychological operations, and the way he describes it is that psychological operations were always secondary after physical war, right? They were basically ways to enhance your physical warfare. And the argument in this book and the 3-volume series is that it needs to be inverted. That physical war should basically be a last resort when mind war or psychological operations fail.
Maybe it will get answered, but I'm also curious as to how, like, where the field of war is. If it is contained to like a sphere, or like it's just unleashed on everyone.
Yeah. So here, let me explain. I'll give you a quote from him. He says, this is under the first chapter is the subtitle is "What is it? Mind War. What is it?" Okay. It says mind war controls human external action thoughts by identifying and adjusting the sensory impressions that the mind uses to assemble, modify, and reinforce them. Human sensory-based thoughts form the basis for their constructed outward personalities, and in groups their mores, biases, beliefs, traditions, habits, and taboos. Thus, through a graduated process, mind war controls groups of humans. As the size of the group increases, common features of impressions, attitudes, and expressions emerge and can be identified and analyzed statistically, making possible social forecasting and the control of that future by aggregate, not individual manipulation. Okay, so basically think like social media here. Now, technically, okay, this was drafted in terms of how to engage foreign enemies for United States military action. So in other words, right, you're battling a country, you got boots on the ground, okay, you're in the middle of physical warfare, but you also want to try to get basically the other side to surrender. And so the way that you would do that is basically playing on internal divisions in the country, right? And so, if you're fighting a nation and, the leader is a dictator in one way or another, right? And you build on the oppressive nature of the regime, and you sort of stoke people who are basically oppressed into basically coming to your side, right? And so that's where he basically, that quote here about that sensory-based thoughts form the basis of people's outward constructed personalities, and in groups their mores, biases, beliefs, traditions, habits, and taboos. These are basically assumptions that people bring to the table about whatever values they associate with their culture or their society. Okay. And so, in other words, he in this book, he contrasts it with, there's a section on MK Ultra in here, and he basically contrasts it with those types of what we might know as mind control, like brainwashing, where somehow you're going to interfere with the thinking process and basically make like a Manchurian candidate or something. He basically says that doesn't work. Okay. Like, it basically does more damage to the mind. And ultimately what you want, as I sort of read in the preface on the back side, is you want the willing and conscious participation of the enemy to come to your side. Okay. And in doing so, therefore, you don't want to scramble the brain, so to speak. What you want to do is you want to play on the sort of a priori assumptions or values that they associate with, whether it be their ethnicity, their class, their religion, political ideology, and based on the things, the values that they hold, before they start thinking about a particular issue or a particular conflict, that's how you get groups to participate. Okay, in other words, right, like, just to use an example. Okay, most people, this is sort of the way on one end of the paradigm in this current polarized country. One end of the paradigm thinks sort of like this. Okay, if you're right wing, you're a Trumper. If you're a Trumper, you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, you're a white supremacist. If you're a white supremacist, right? And it's, so you associate, these are all the taboos or the mores or the values that are assumed by anybody who in one way or another affiliates with or identifies with something right of center. Okay. And then there's emotional reactions attached to those categories. Right. And so it works sort of both ways, right? Like, if you're on, yeah, go ahead.
I also think of even the COVID narrative, right? The Chinese, the bad, market, like, unsanitary conditions, and that's how it was initially sold, right? Like that idea that this virus came from a bat and like from a dirty market, right? And of course, it was the Chinese.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of the silos, right? I mean, so it's like, okay, there's the whole, it's all China narrative, right? China is it's China trying to take us over. Well, there's some truth to that, except that we're also funding it. You know what I mean? Like, so and this is sort of an example, right? So like, if you're, right of center, right? If you turn on like Fox News or Newsmax, it's all about China, 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 they're coming to get us. If you turn on CNN or, MSNBC, it's Russia, 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 right? And I'm sure, right, there's some truth on both ends of it. I'm sure that there's foreign meddling in our elections from every country that has any ability to do so, right? And so basically what that does, though, is it polarizes, where not only do you point the finger at the other side, you have an emotional reaction when the finger's pointed at you, right? So you sort of dig your heels in, right? And so with like the whole woke paradigm, right? Like, so you have, black and brown people, talking about police brutality, and then you get, critical race theory in the schools, and then the reaction from conservatives, you have this sort of sub-siloed bubble of this basically white identity politics, right? So it's like, you know, in other words, for those people on the right to acknowledge that yes, there is racism is somehow is against that means they're against white people, right? And vice versa, right? If a white person says something like, I don't feel like I should have white guilt. My parents came here, way after, slavery was over. That the other side reacts, well, that's just white fragility and suppressed white supremacy. Okay. And so again, what this is doing is it's building on the mores and the taboos and the values that are a priori associated with any of the information that comes from either side, right? Before you analyze, is there racism, right? Or before you analyze, is there anything, worth salvaging in terms of our nation's history or the Constitution, right? You already have all these other identity categories that you have emotional attachments to, that you basically bring to the table, and it's entirely reactionary at that point. Now, another part of that quote that's relevant for what we're talking about here is where it says, as the size of the group increases, common features of impressions, attitudes, and expressions emerge and can be identified and analyzed statistically, making possible social forecasting and the control of that future by aggregate, not individual manipulation. Now think social media, right? In other words, to the extent that any of these assumptions existed prior to the world of social media and, the different silos that have sort of developed around, alt-right or alt-left or whatever you want to call all these new categories of what it means to, have political discourse in this country. The emergence of social media has enabled big tech and intelligence agencies to refine their understanding of those mores, taboos, a priori values. And in other words, right, by seeing how people who identify as right-wing use particular slogans, right, and vice versa, people on the left who use particular slogans, you can identify basically keywords. You can take those keywords, you can sort of spin them semantically, and then galvanize them around sort of a leader. Okay. And then what happens is, right, more people who identify as right of center, who maybe didn't identify with that particular keyword or that slogan, because there's this sort of this build up or this sort of, this massive movement, for lack of a better term, that sort of galvanizes around a Trump or a QAnon or any number of alt media figures, that again, people who didn't associate with particular slogans will gravitate to those slogans. And now, right, instead of having to deal with individual thoughts, right, if you can basically create a polarized dialectic between two groups or more, okay, and you might be able to sort of draw a line down the middle of the country in many ways, but even within those two sides, or you could chop it up. But basically, right, you can get individuals to participate in these group movements, and by controlling just a handful of groups, right, you can sort of control the narrative and what otherwise might be resistance, civil disobedience, or some other opposition to wherever the country's going at that moment in time. Yeah.
Well, what comes up for me in that when you talk about individual versus aggregate, I want to talk about it in relationship to something I'm somewhat familiar with in science in terms of temperature and molecular motion. Because what's meaningful for me is that so bear with me here as I talk about individual things like molecules moving around inside of a container, which they can move at different speeds. And generally, when you add energy to some container, we would imagine that the molecules inside will get faster and faster. They'll have different speeds. Their average speed will increase as you add energy, but that describing the speed of the molecule, oh, it's going faster, it's going slower, it's going medium speed. That's an individual description of something happening inside that container. When you want to discuss what's going on inside that container as an aggregate, you're not talking about molecular motion. You're talking about temperature. It's a completely different thing now. And so what I hear in this, in terms of the way he's approaching this, is to say, this is not a useful method by just looking at speeds, if you will, or thoughts of individuals. You have to understand this phenomena and approach it from an aggregate, which means you're actually sometimes measuring different things than you would if you're looking at the individual compared to when you're looking at an entire group. That's something that also comes up for me as when I heard that, because that notion of aggregate phenomena versus individual phenomena is also a part of science in terms of what are you really studying and what is useful for moving it and for making predictions about what things are going to happen. Speed of molecules is not the same thing as the temperature of a solution or a container, but they're connected, but they're different. One's an individual phenomena, one's an aggregate phenomenon. And so that's interesting to me that's a term that he would use. I think it's bigger than just saying, well, we're just trying to move groups. I think it actually, to me, it expresses the fact that we're not actually going to be measuring or doing the same sorts of things when we're talking about an aggregate issue versus when we're talking about something that's individualized.
No, it makes sense as to what is being described and as to the moment that we live in. Like obviously there is like vast amounts of data from individuals being gathered, and like focusing on one individual requires a lot of energy and resources, and it's actually more efficient to focus it on a group, and try to guide those groups in a way. And like I personally have thought that we've been at that point, but this gives me more of a frame to kind of think about what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, and in a lot of ways, I mean, I think also what he's getting at is you can, in many ways, you can actually effectively control individuals based on your ability to control, again, the mores, habits, and taboos of the group process, right? I mean, and so, I mean, just think of something like, okay, like if a corporation, is willing to use, all the necessary pronouns and have a Black Lives Matter flag, right? I mean, people that are left leaning, right, are going to basically be favorable to that company, right, in ways that they otherwise, would have an instinctive sort of, aversion to just the whole corporate paradigm, right? And the same thing goes for the whole Trump thing and the MAGA thing, right? I mean, like if you want to say, as long as he uses the rhetoric of nationalism and make America great again, right? It doesn't matter, who the fact that he's got someone like Wilbur Ross, who's Bilderberger, as the Secretary of Commerce, right? Like they'll because he used those keywords that that's what my group identifies with, right? You will sort of selectively choose what you want to pay attention to, and then you will go along with whatever is at the apex of that pyramid, right? In other words, so the figureheads are basically the temperature variable, right? And where the figurehead goes, where that temperature goes, all the little nodes, all the little individuals, right? Whether knowingly or unknowingly, right? They'll largely follow it more or less. Yeah.
I was going to take it in a slightly different direction. So Ken, if you have a question on this.
No, just again, for me, it makes me think about like the vaccine mandates and the impetus behind the vaccines, and how, like, again, keywords and like, do it for grandma, do it for your neighbor, protect other people, and obviously it captured a certain group. It obviously there was a resistance on the other side, but it captured a certain group that was very militant and willing to not see it, like you said, the apex or what's really behind it, just like those keywords, and not inquire more. and it was very good at creating compliance and without questioning, and while people were feeling that they were doing the right thing out of virtue, and and so it is a powerful thing. Again, that's how I see this, in a very real term. That's what I saw happening, and it was confusing because, again, people that I thought we share similar values, but then they only went so far, right? And that's probably, it was kind of bizarre, right? But it shows the power of, like, I guess, hurting people in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, and what else is implicit in that is that you can actually change the value. You can change the values of the individual by changing the values of the group by semantic association of a term, which does, in terms of diction, represent a particular value. But if you take that slogan and you sort of double speak it out of context and you associate it with this larger group movement, it can come to represent something else, right? I mean, I think that kind of maybe describes the phenomenon you're talking about, because it's like, right, I thought we had the same values, and you probably did, but the way this works is that what you understand is that value, or your intuitions about that value, get subsumed in its conflation with other rhetoric that has nothing to do with that value. And the reason you go along with it is because the larger group, basically all the consensus is that, yeah, that value, that word means this value. And, whatever cognitive dissonance you might have is actually, you're actually drawn into it, because in a lot of ways, and this is sort of what he's getting at here, is that, our personal perceptions, in many ways, like it or not, often our sanity is judged by are we doing what other people are doing around us, right? I mean, that's one metric to see, like, am I the only person that thinks this? Well, maybe it's just me, that type of phenomenon, right? So yeah, I did I ever, well, you want to go in a different direction, but I don't think I ever read that definition, and I found the term, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, you might get back to that definition, because, so first off, the thing that this guy Aquino is claiming, which is that the actual the real war is a mental and physical and is a mental war even prior to the physical war, and like the physical war is kind of the war of last response. If you're gonna effectively fight a war, you have to engage it mentally first and foremost, and that's your greatest terrain of action. And then, if you must, you'll resort to the more physical war. And that certainly resonates for me as a Marxist, as I think of a capitalist class and a working class, which we describe as in constant warfare. And the nature of that warfare within this country, and I think in all countries, for the most part, exists mostly as the mental war, as institutional warfare. And of course, they're willing to use prisons, they're willing to use troops, they're willing to use police, they're willing to use the state apparatus as an act of repression. But particularly in the most industrialized countries, the European Union, I would say China, I would say United States, their first go-to is co-optation and getting the cooperation of the working class through this thing. But I think I want to go beyond this part, because what I agree with is all the information we're getting, whether it be from a CNN or Fox or Democrat or Republican, that entire operation is a PSYOP. The whole operation, the whole thing, right? It's penetrated. It's undergirded with a deep lie, which is this is about controlling you. And the only reason for the flecks of truth in it is to use it. The only reason it has any truth in it is so that truth can be used to control you. Because we're not trying to give you information, we're trying to move you. We're trying to control you and manipulate you with this entire operation in front of you, from our schools, from our corporations, from our media, the whole thing. So that whole thing is a PSYOP. Cool. But I still feel like most people, I think most people accept that. But then we get to this other area of PSYOP, which is now we have the people who are against the narrative, say in COVID, and then people go, well, that guy's a PSYOP. Desmond is a PSYOP. This Belgian guy who was a critic, the doctor who was a critic of some elements of the virus, of the way the vaccines were being put out. He's a PSYOP. Dr. Malone's a PSYOP. McCullough's a PSYOP. You know, those sorts of things. I'm not saying yes, I'm not saying no, but that's the one I want to talk about a little bit, are these figures, and how is that term being used? Is it not accurate because, oh yeah, that person's a PSYOP? What are we talking about there? And maybe that's where we get into unlimited hangout. Maybe that's when we get into something else.
Limited.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Just in case, it's all right.
Maybe that's when we get to limited hangout and controlled opposition. But to me, that's where most of us are spending our time, throwing these terms around and trying to. And often they've been used to me as to get me to not listen to somebody. I should stop paying attention to them. I should not see them as a source of information. And so I wonder if you can speak about that, the veracity of that, the value of it. I don't know. That's what I want to spend. That's kind of what I want to spend this episode talking about.
Yeah. Okay, so this is actually a good segue for me to go back to that definition and then define the three types of propaganda that are used in psychological operations. All right, so this definition of psychological operations, PSYOP, that comes from the military information support operations, which basically is a euphemism for PSYOP that they came up with in 2010. Okay, and these definitions of PSYOP are from a field manual prior to the change in language to what's called MISO, M-I-S-O, military information support operations. So psychological operations is defined as planned operations to convey selected information and indicators to foreign audiences to influence their emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of foreign governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. The purpose of psychological operations is to induce or reinforce foreign attitudes and behavior favorable to the originator's objectives. Okay, so remember, the manual is geared towards we're not going to do it to our own people, so supposedly, right? Okay, but I'm going to show you some more recent documents. Actually, they were published around the time that that they changed this terminology to the MISO. But he talks about three different types of propaganda that are used in psychological operations. Okay, the first is called white propaganda. Then there's gray propaganda, and then there's black propaganda. Okay, and these terms actually, he's got a little footnote here, and he says that once they changed all the doublespeak language in the MISO documents, that they changed white propaganda to concurring or organizational propaganda, gray propaganda to attribution/delayed propaganda, and then the black propaganda is attribution/non-attribution. Okay, and those terms, like, even when I read to you the definitions of the old white, gray, and black, those terms are very confusing, and there's a reason why. But that language is going to you're going to see it basically echoed in another document that I'm going to show you in a second. All right, so white propaganda is propaganda in which the source is openly and accurately stated. Gray propaganda is propaganda in which no source is stated. Okay, black propaganda is propaganda in which the source is deliberately and explicitly misrepresented. I would say that what you described as like mainstream media, right, that tells you it's a constant Pfizer commercial, get your jab, the virus is gonna, end humanity, all that type of stuff. I would say that's basically white propaganda, right? I mean, like the media is explicitly reporting what the CDC or whatever government agency message there is being given to them. Okay. Now I'm not saying that there couldn't be gray or black propaganda that comes through mainstream media, but right, the phenomena you describe where, sort of they are providing an official statement from the government and basically vouching for it, and that we all sort of recognize, classically for at least, certainly since the rise of alt media, as basically at best very, very little bit of useful information in there, right? This is explicitly easily identifiable propaganda. The black propaganda, propaganda in which the source is deliberately and explicitly misrepresented, I would say that that would be a particular flavor of certain alt media operations. In other words, right, the alt media is representing itself as something that is exposing the psyop or is exposing the truth, but actually, right, either by omission or maybe deliberate disinformation, right? They're giving you certain information that sort of exposes and calls out the mainstream media, but they have other directives. Now, some of them are, could just be grifters or opportunists, just clickbaity, want to make money. But certainly there are definitely certain media operations in the alt sphere that are getting their directives right from probably intelligence, whether military or just intelligence agencies outside of the Department of Defense. Okay, the gray propaganda in which no source is stated, I would say that's something. I mean, it could be anything just from a rumor that somehow starts to get circulated. But I think a good example of that is ostensibly or is something like QAnon, right? I mean, so in other words, right? It's anonymous. I mean, it's Q, right? But who's Q? Nobody knows, right? Vice just did a whole documentary like, who is Q? And I mean, there's plenty of theories out there, and without getting into the weeds in it, I mean, I imagine it's Q is not a single person, right? I imagine it's an aggregate of all this stuff. And as a matter of fact, the guy who commissioned Aquino to write this paper, Paul Vallely, he was involved in the white paper. Okay, so he collaborated on this. He's also psychological operations. He was a big QAnon promoter. Okay, so I wouldn't be surprised if the whole QAnon thing, right, as a form of gray propaganda in which, right, we don't know who the source is actually this operation gone live using internet media. Okay, and I'll show you. There's something called interactive internet activity. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to make something clear, when you use what we're talking about with the use of white propaganda and black propaganda and gray propaganda, is Aquino is saying that that state institutions will use all three layers or all three colors as a mechanism for overall social control, and that he's saying we will operate at all these levels, and that is how we will control people.
Yeah, and he's got a whole section in there on like ethics, relative ethics, and that it's not about whether the information is true or false or ethical. It's only about does it achieve the objective.
Yes, that makes complete sense to me. Otherwise, it's not a mind war. It's a mind suggestion. It's a mind, whatever. But so I would agree with that. Like if one is fighting a mind war in the way that they're talking about, the truth doesn't matter. It's about whether they get whether they would get this particular. It's about the outcome.
Yeah, and the outcome he refers to these different phases, and basically the objective is to create a state that's known as meaning a social state, okay, socio-political state that's known as the Eristos, and he equivocates this with what he calls stabilization. Right. In other words, the enemy combatants are now on board with your end result, whatever that might be for a particular, war objective in a foreign nation. Okay, and I find that it's interesting that he picks Aristos. This is the root for words like aristocracy. That Aristos means the best. Okay, and the concept of an aristocracy actually goes back to Plato's Republic, right, in which these enlightened philosopher kings will actually, part of it is they need to use what he calls a noble lie to basically trick people into all being part of this, this. It's effectively a collectivized hierarchy of basically a bronze, silver, gold caste system under these philosopher kings, which, in our modern paradigm we can call technocrats. And I also find that interesting that he uses that. Like, he refers to Plato quite a bit, but as somebody who was at LaVey's Church of Satan, creates his own Temple of Set. Basically they're coming out of the Aleister Crowley tradition, and that is rooted in Gnosticism, and Gnosticism is Neoplatonic. Okay, and so it's just, I don't think he's choosing that word accidentally, right? I mean, I think he's picking that for a particular reason. Okay,
having lived outside of the U.S., it's like, like I often make this statement that we're one of the most propagandized countries in the world, and it's because I'm not saying that this shit doesn't happen in other countries. It's easy to see in other countries, but and it also brings me to Frantz Fanon, where he talks about economic north has mediators of confusers and people that mediate the actions of the state, the will of the state. Whereas in countries like Nicaragua, like they have to use the brute force more directly, because but again, it's a different level of compliance or participation in this system. It's done differently, but it achieves a similar purpose, compliance, and it's just like so hard to see for a lot of people, right? Like and that's what we point fingers at other countries, and because we're unable to see that happening here constantly, all the time, every day, and that's why it's almost freeing when you're not seeing the news. That's why I understand a lot of people who are like, I don't want to, I don't care about the news, or I don't want to vote, or I don't want to hear to this. Like, I understand, people more now. I used to judge them because I was in that system, very, very entrenched into, the liberal side of these kind of games. But it's just insane. Like, and it takes a lot of energy to be plugged into this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I've quoted in a past episode, I've got back here Edward Bernays' book titled "Propaganda," and I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's pretty close, which is basically says something like, "The attitudes and desires and appetites of the masses is not formed by their own perceptions. It's formed by what he literally calls a secret government," right? And it's through propaganda, whether corporate government or otherwise. And he was part of something called the Creel Commission, which is the Committee on Public Information, which was basically the first propaganda arm of, pro war propaganda, machine, basically. Okay. And so, there's a long military history to propaganda. And, as you note, it's especially now we just described one layer of propaganda, which is your mainstream media. Okay, then we've got another layer of propaganda called your alt media. Okay, and then we've got a whole nother layer of propaganda in something like a QAnon operation, right? Which is, it operates through social media and alt media, but it's a different operation, or it's another facet entirely, right? In other words, right, there was propaganda in alt media before there was QAnon. QAnon sort of creates this, it's basically what's known as an augmented reality game, right? It comes out of the whole Cicada 3301 puzzles, okay? And basically, to cut to the chase, you take the puzzle out of the computer, you put it in the real world, and so now the puzzle is, Trump said something and the clock was at 10, and that means that the 10 refers to, and then you take that, you play that game, and then you act it out through, various rallies or whatever. Eventually you show up at January 6th, not knowing that you're in the middle of a PSYOP LARP. And that's why you have, there was people that were getting violent, but there was also people that were like, hey, taking pictures of themselves because they're basically transferring a puzzle game off the internet and bringing it into the real world in a political situation with permanent consequences that basically enabled them to get, their domestic terror law. So with all these layers of, right, I mean, in some ways, like you said, I had a friend, I visited an old friend last weekend, and he said, "Yeah, I don't follow it." I said, "Nor should you. It's better for your mental health to not do so." He's an older guy; he's retired and stuff. They've got a psyop for every flavor and everything you can think, and I don't know how you can, at some level, getting truthful information requires sifting through all of it, right? There is no just like, oh, this is my guy, I can watch this guy, or this is my trusted source, or right, you always have to, the who, what, where, when, the primary source. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, now you're moving into something that, if we want to go there, because I don't think I agree with that. Like, I agree with it's penetrated through and through. I don't think I agree with that conclusion in terms of how we are going to deal with that. But I think that's the part I want to end this conversation on. So
yeah, no, I don't want to jump ahead. But okay, let me show you an example of sort of how this operates. Okay. All right, so this is a document that I found from Deputy Secretary of Defense. This is June 8, 2007. And basically what it documents is this subject here: policy for Department of Defense interactive internet activities. Okay. And let me just,
read purpose, man. And purpose just says it all.
yeah, there was a couple quotes in here that I wanted to get to, but let me just go ahead. So purpose says interactive internet activities are an essential part of DoD's responsibilities. Make it bigger so that people can actually probably read it. To provide information to the public, shape the security environment, and support military operations. This policy provides authority and guidance for these activities. Okay, so that says definition. The policy defines interactive internet activities as the use of a system accessible via the internet, which allows for two-way communications, e.g. email, blogs, chat rooms, and internet bulletin boards in a timely, if not real-time basis, as opposed to a system in which information flows only one way, like the TV or the radio. Okay, so this is a new phase in PSYOPs that have been perpetrated through, traditional broadcast media. All right, and it says, here it goes. Scope. This policy applies to public affairs activities and to programs, products, and actions that shape emotions, motives, reasonings, and behaviors of selected foreign entities. Let me read to you again the definition of PSYOP from that field manual prior to the MISO document. It says, planned operations to convey selected information and indicators to foreign audience to influence their emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of foreign governments, right? Basically the same phrasing, okay? In other words, what they're saying is that by dint of the common rhetoric that this interactive internet activities program is basically a psychological operations, okay? And here where it says the authority comes under Geographic Combatant Commanders and Commander U.S. Special Operations Command, okay? Well, Aquino, he describes here that PSYOPs, the PSYOP division is part of special operations, okay? He breaks special operations into three categories. One is civilian affairs. The other one is psychological the other one is special forces. Okay, and these were in special forces, the way he describes it is basically those would be the people that would train some of the indigenous or native peoples to basically team up with the insurgents and to go against their government, which in other words, right, in some ways it's goes in tandem with the PSYOP, right? The PSYOP part in terms of the foreign operation is basically, using various forms of information in media to sort of garner that support, but then the special forces that they would go in and basically train them to once they've been properly adjusted in terms of their beliefs. Okay. Now, one thing about this document is was not able to find it in a .gov website. Okay. Now you can't keyword search it. So in other words, if it is in a .gov, it's basically scanned as a JPEG, meaning, I tried searching particular phrases out of it. I tried searching the code number. Nothing pops up in a .gov. All right. So what I'm suggesting here is that not 100% verified in terms of the document. Its legitimacy. Okay. I found it by looking at a documentary. Okay. That was it was called the Shadowgate documentary. Okay, it was made by Millie Weaver, who's an InfoWars reporter. Okay, and ultimately the guy that sort of blew the whistle on this, his name is Patrick Berge. Okay, and he's got photos with all sorts of military folk. Sounds legit. Okay, the documentary ultimately sort of spins the whole thing like this IIA interactive internet activities program was basically all designed by the left to go after Trump. Although at one point in the documentary, they identify Cambridge Analytica as an IIA operation, which got Trump in office. Okay. In other words, it's, they don't say it like this, but it's both. It's both ends. All right. And the goal is to get what is already where we already are divided in terms of politics, economics, and ideology, to increasingly polarize that, but to direct both of those movements right to the same outcome in the end. Okay, and now to help verify this document, I did find this. Okay, now this is on a .gov. This is defense.gov. This is from the Defense Department, and in here. Okay. Oops. They use the phrase, okay, interactive. The requested amount is for attributed interactive internet activities to counter violent extremist organizations, support and recruitment of hostile and middle ground sites in East Africa and Northwest African regions. Okay, so in other words, it is so I can show you that it is a Department of Defense terminology and a program. Okay, so I would wager that this here is accurate. And basically, the way this guy Berge described it was that this is what they used when he was over there in either Iraq or Afghanistan. I can't remember which one it was. Okay, and you could think of stuff like the Arab Spring, right? Like using social media to sort of get these color revolutions. And now, right, what's going on in this country right now is that it's that operation, right? They just brought it home. Okay. And this is the Smith-Munt Modernization Act. Okay. And so in this, basically, this sort of authorized, for lack of a better term, right, psychological operations or propaganda against foreign entities. Okay. It was issued in 1948. Okay. But the Modernization Act, which is it 2012?
Yep.
2011, 2012. This one authorized the use of propaganda and PSYOPs. Not on the, you got to look at the language in it. All right. It's all circular. But basically what it does is it allows them to subject the domestic population to such operations. Okay. And so if I go see domestic, so it says clarification on domestic distribution of program material. In general, no funds authorized to be appropriated to the Department of State or the Broadcasting Board of Government shall be used to influence the public opinion in the United States. Okay, it's saying you're not allowed to explicitly and directly and overtly do this to the domestic population. If you read down here in this next part, it says rule of construction. Nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit the Department of State or the Broadcasting Board of Governors from engaging in any medium or form of communication, either directly or indirectly, because the United States domestic audience is or may be thereby exposed to program material or based on a presumption of such exposure. Such material may be made available within the United States and disseminated when appropriate, pursuant to sections 502 and 1005 of the United States Information and Educational Exchange Act of 1984, except that nothing in this section may be construed to authorize the Department of State or the Broadcasting Board of Governors to disseminate within the United States any program material prepared for dissemination abroad or on or behalf before the effective date of the Smith Modernization Act. In other words, basically what that's saying is like, you can't actually draft up something that says we're going to target the American people. But if you're targeting a foreign audience and you do it through a channel in which Americans might be subjected to it, well, that's okay, because we didn't target you. And even if it has the same PSYOP effects on the American people, we're not responsible because we didn't do it on purpose. That's basically what that says. Okay, but it authorizes the use basically of these IIA type activities, not just foreign against foreign powers, but against us domestically. Okay, and yes, go ahead.
Well, I think that's great double speak, but I did want to make one thing, and I think I don't know if you would agree with this, Jake. So we'll see, because again, I constantly look at these through my Marxist lens, which basically says that all imperial wars are predicated on the ability for its ruling class to make war on its own population. No capitalist state can make war abroad unless it first makes war on its own people and extracts surplus value, extracts the resources out of its own people to give it the basis to do a war abroad, to then expand itself even more externally. Because the reason I want to say that is I don't think you or I would believe that starting 2012, because of this Munt Act, that the U.S. started on a PSYOP on the American people, and in 1948 it wasn't doing it. Or if you go earlier to 1912, they weren't doing PSYOP operations on the American people. I would say these PSYOP operations have been a continuity of the U.S. ruling class in various levels of complexity and various levels of understanding. And scientists and researchers like Aquino may give voice to something that's been going on for maybe centuries, actually, or even earlier than that. But I don't think any of us I don't think anybody here, of the three of us, would say, well, they just recently figured out that this thing that they were using on foreign populations can be brought home. I would actually contend that they were always really understood as domestic population controllers that could best be justified through the ways they were fighting their foreign wars. And that the foreign war is the angle by which they can openly talk about it in some way in public. But even then, they have to cover their ass and put those little things in there. And then even in that little 2012 document, have a contradiction that exposes that, well, if it turns out that some of our foreign propaganda also affects our domestic population, well, that's for security. So just to be clear on that is like, or at least for me, I feel that way, is at no point was the U.S. ruling class confused about who their enemy was.
Yeah, no, go ahead. King was, yeah.
Like honestly, for me, this document itself feels like a PSYOP itself, because it's supposedly providing a legal framework, right, as to how to use this. And yes, there is the double speak in that, but again, just like Lipson is saying, none of us believe that the propaganda on the U.S. population started recently, but it provides the illusion of legality in operating within a framework.
But I want to say something about why something like this is pernicious. Is there is an advancement in this. We know there is more censorship now than there was 10 years ago. So something like this does sort of operate as a side, but it also operates as an actual moving front of the war for them to say, we are taking territory now. We were back in this territory, and now we are advancing into this city and to that city. So it isn't just something to kind of like, it represents an actual advancement on the front for them to say, we're coming into this city and we're taking it over. We have future cities to take in, like if we think about it as a war. So I do see this document as threatening, and also in the way that Kenny's saying, but I actually think it's true about Kenny's saying, but I also think it represents an actual threat and advancement of their cause in pursuing this war.
Right. I mean, okay, so we've already identified, right? I mean, going back to, Bernays and the Creel Commission, propaganda, being waged, at the American people. And, then you've got stuff like Operation Mockingbird, right? Which I believe was, let's say around the 70s or something like that. Okay, so I mean, there's plenty of examples of PSYOPs being perpetrated against the American people, prior to Aquino's mind war or the IIA program. What the IIA program does, as you sort of suggest, is what it does do is uh, it's basically making it about as explicit and overt as possible, right? Whereas something like Operation Mockingbird, right, wasn't really like publicly known, while it was operational, right? At least not right, in the early phases, anyways. Okay, um, and so this sort of is, like you said, a little more pernicious because it's like we don't even have to hide it. Like we'll basically tell you we're going to do it to you. And if you think about, okay, and your argument about how basically in many ways foreign wars, I mean, obviously there's reasons as far as exploiting resources and territory and expansion, just on an imperial basis. There's its own reason for having a foreign war, but at another level, it does create the boogeyman that enables you to curtail the civil rights in your own country and to crack down on your own people. And the impetus to this whole paradigm that we're in here now begins with 9/11, right? Which we I think we all agree here was its own psyop, right? We played the video, Building 7 in the background, the BBC woman. I forget which episode we were doing, but right, we played it, and she's saying that it fell in its footsteps and it's still behind her. Okay, and it's just to me that's your best example of something's the story you got is not the whole story. All right, and what came out of that? Well, I mean, it was these the scary Al Qaeda people, right? They're gonna come over here at any moment. So we got to have this Patriot Act things, which enables us to spy on you. So this is the first step in this. Now recall that it's basically right around that time that LifeLog pops up. Right, was proposed. And LifeLog was basically it was basically the government version of Facebook. Okay. And I can't remember if it was right before or right after. Okay. I want to say it was shortly after. But fact check that. Okay. But it's sometime between 2000 and 2002. All right. And basically everybody was creeped out. Like a government program that has everything I do on it. Like, yeah, that's kind of creepy. I don't think that's a great idea, right? So lo and behold, as soon as that project is squashed, it's almost immediately Facebook pops up. All right, and so now you have basically the beginnings of the infrastructure. So you have the legal impetus to spy on people. You hand out all the devices necessary to build the infrastructure to do so, okay? And then now with the IIA and the algorithms that are used for the behavioral advertising, which is what puts the people into the groups based on their mores and habits and other a priori associations. Now you can basically sort of engineer the population, and so I would intuit that at that point, right? At that point, at the point at which the Patriot Act and LifeLog / Facebook are rolled out, that there was already a growing sort of alt media, the truth movement, whatever you want to call people that were had questions about 9/11 and where we were going as a country and where the police state was going, how that was going to metastasize into basically where we're at now. That they knew that before they tried to roll this out there, that opposition would be there, right? As a matter of fact, right, it did pop up after the fact. So I would intuit that at that point, they basically were either building alt media operations or trying to rope in or buy off or otherwise recruit alt media operations that could be used as figureheads to galvanize large groups into these social media psychological profiles in order to basically take those oppositional groups and find ways that you can coalesce them together, but find ways that you can play them off each other, okay, and in doing so, basically, what we have now is this phenomenon of the Great Reset versus the Great Awakening, right? And so basically, you have both of these things, right? I mean, represent the polarized nature of everything from do you believe the election was taken? Do you believe the COVID was as bad as they said it was? You know, these things basically turn into these battles between the Proud Boys and BLM, which provides this civil war narrative where ultimately, if the goal of the Great Reset is to bring in a technocracy and social credit and predictive analytics and pre-crime, right? And then you're going to have something that's going to push against it. We'll call this the Great Awakening, right? And you can sort of play those two things off each other, right? Ultimately, if you can radicalize both sides to where, they're essentially have either a real civil war or an impending civil war, well, now you still have justification to roll out your social credit and your pre-crime, regardless of whether there's another pandemic or a Green New Deal, right? And this is where, this whole idea of grouping people into these various PSYOP categories, right? The idea is that what you might call controlled opposition or the limited hangout, right? That's how it's controlled, because when you show up, you think you're just going to stop the steal, and guess what? Now they brought the Patriot Act home, right? 20 years after the fact.
So maybe in a similar way, okay, now the Great Reset is the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, those George Soros, the United States, China, globalists, right? The Great Awakening, I imagine then, is unlimited hangout, you and me. Maybe it can extend into people. Some people might think it extends into DeSantis and even Trump sometimes. Whatever, is that what we're talking about? Like, the Great Awakening are the people who were in opposition to the Great Reset, Fourth Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, and I would say that, we have to use these categories and not to paint with too broad a brush, but I would say that Great Awakening is largely what you might consider the right of center opposition. It largely encompasses your MAGA people. It's a phrase that was used by QAnon. Okay, it's sort of this pseudo evangelical Judeo Christian identity politics. And you probably get swallowed up in there, some white identity politics, and there's a new age flavor part of it as well. Like, remember who's the QAnon shaman guy, and in the Great Awakening, to refer back to one of our previous episodes, that's a term that Barbara Marx covered and a lot of the New Agers used, right? But it's basically, yeah, it gets used it's been used by Michael Flynn. Alex Jones has promoted it. Okay. But it's largely, yes, it's people that are against the Great Reset, but I would say that they largely align more towards right of center politics.
But either way, one could say you're going to be shoved into one we can shove anyone into. So Andy is going to be put on the Great Awakening side, right?
Yeah, right. So then there's people like me and you that, like, we don't really fit in to any of the categories, but in perception, okay, if you go to my website, I've been on way more right of center podcasts,
and it's the reason why when Randy and I go and we go to the farmers market and we put up our against surveillance, against vax mandates. Why, even if I'm red through and through, I'm a leftist, or from tradition at least, one still wants to hold to that. The liberal and left people in that community fucking lose their minds, and they can't. They think we're Trump, basically, because we're the Great Awakening, and that's I think that's what you're describing. Like, the effort to control this thing is going to be used by essentially the divisions into these two big camps, but both these camps all have a source to the top. They're not actually separate. They unite somewhere at the top because the the information from both sides is being controlled by the top.
Yeah, yeah, and I would say that sort of on the other end of the spectrum is sort of we'll just call them the lockdown left, right? Sort of the hardcore woke types, right? Like that again, right? Are also right. They're fighting for all types of societal reforms, right? But how much of that actually is basically rhetoric that's also touted by the World Economic Forum and these companies, right? So and at the end of it, right? I mean, at the bottom line is, right, the clash that they want is between those two halves of the country, or really the planet, right? Like, so two groups of people, and I think this is largely the goal, right? Is that, regardless of what you believe about, what is salvageable to the American Republic and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, their goal is to get rid of it. Okay, whether the oligarchs ever believed in it, or whether they whether it was always just something that they used to sort of rhetorically manipulate, or whether that actually was a bulwark against some of their power. I'm not making that argument. The point is that system has to move. That system has to be out of the way. We need a new system, the fourth industrial revolution of technocracy. So, right, they want to galvanize any group that wants a new system, right? Whether it be you want to go back to the MAGA thing, or sort of this great awakening thing on the right is not traditional conservatism, okay? And then the whole, this what we'll just call the left movements, right, is not classical liberalism like you're used to, okay? But what they both have in common is that they want to flip the system, right? And so if you can take that energy and direct it at the two halves of the country and have them fight instead of right, have some sort of a civil reform, or come together and have some civil reform, that you can achieve both objectives, right? You can get rid of the the old system, and right, by means of having to quell the civil war or whatever that they're trying to stir up, that becomes a further justification to bring in the new system, right? And so in a lot of ways, and this is why I think you had said something about how we solve it. I mean, like, I see that well-meaning and well-intentioned desires for some type of reform on either end of the spectrum, right, is being steered towards a conflict that's going to basically turn on everybody on either side, and it's basically going to be used to clinch their checkmate, basically.
I mean, that is in a way like the sense that I do have. Like there is change. Like people want something to change, but that energy is co-opted, and I do tend to share that view. In that, in opening my eyes to listening to people of the right, in the concerns that they have, and the concerns that people on the left have. Yeah, the change is gonna come. There is energy in like I personally don't think that energy can be created out of nowhere. I think it's there. People feel a certain sense of something is wrong, but it will be there will be an attempt to be guided. Whether they can do it. Whether they can fully control it. That's a question that that I have, but I do have that sense that there is energy on the ground, and so I'm trying to be in the middle, I guess, or listen to everyone, and and that's what I hear.
Yeah, I probably have more disagreements with what you're saying, Jake, in terms of some of the overall framing in this regard, because I don't think this is about the U.S. Constitution. I still think this is about capitalism, and I don't think this is about a new system, or even the capitalists revolutionizing and getting rid of capitalism. But it's run into its own new crises, and they have to make changes in it in order for it to get out of the existing crisis. And they've had to do this with capitalism all along the way when it runs into problems, and they fought, in my opinion, they have fought wars over these things to resolve deep crises, and had to kill millions of people to get through it sometimes, and destroy billions of dollars worth of property and stuff because of these crises. So I still think this is the same system in operation, nothing new. And secondly, for all the talk they make of they're fomenting a civil war, I don't. I think the capitalists are deathly afraid of an actual civil war, something like, I would say, something like the Paris Commune, Russian Revolution that took place, a workers' revolution, but because they know that they're going to be separating wealth increasingly from workers, and they're going to make their life miserable. It's the reason why Brandy was telling me that Target is now have essentially like armed militias there now guarding their stuff, where it used to be rent-a-cops. Now it's people in it's almost like South America without the guns strapped over. They're getting there because they recognize something is coming. So, but I do see them, and this is where I see Biden and Trump doing this brilliantly. Essentially taking the populist anger on both ends and directing that populist anger upwards, not the anger towards those, but the energy of that anger is going towards each side to say, you represent me versus you represent me, and while we'll fight each other here at the bottom. And to me, that really is a mechanism that the fact that the Republicans and Democrats represent essentially the same group, it means that there's no fight at all. Like, you're not fighting these two sides. You're literally taking the energy of your anger to support those sides and keep them in power. So in the name of what to me looks like a very fake civil war, because there's no real opposition between the Republicans and Democrats in terms of, if you look at the power base at the top, those two are not fighting each other. They are lockstep in a good cop, bad cop operation of controlling their own population, as well as how to project power, in my opinion, to either fight China, Russia, and control the globe even more. So I see them as fomenting fake civil wars in order to get people to prop up their power, and also in an effort to stop any real civil war from happening. Because I do believe they are worried about that. They've looked at enough history to know that if you make wealth inequality this much, eventually you will foment the kind of anger that's going to take us down. So how do we survive in that? And in fact, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, in terms of data collection and things like that, looks to me like they think they might have solved the problem of how do you control a population while expanding wealth inequality.
Yeah, I don't think we're really disagreeing, though. I mean, as far as that goes, I mean, like, it's, look, so, right, this whole thing about the most recent thing with Trump, okay? Oh, they raided his house. Now, okay, if you're on the left, or whatever, the Biden left, whatever you want to call it, right? Well, that proves that he is, insurrectionist and a criminal. If you're on the right, it goes, see, that proves that they are going after him. So, and no matter what happens, everybody digs their feet in deeper, and those silos that are created through what we described in Mind War are solidified. And in other words, right, Biden with his, bright red stuff in the background. Okay, right. So the narrative on TV is, Trump and Biden, but operationally, it's ultimately to associate people who are MAGA or right of center, whatever, Great Awakening, Trump, so that they can. It doesn't have to be a legitimate civil war. All they have to do is make the perception of it credible, right? I mean, have another January 6th where you got a bunch of LARPers up here, a couple of provocateurs get violent, and all these people that, were basically living in a video game, you get locked up. But okay, long term, if we can use that to have pre-crime social credit, we can just go ahead and pick people up. We don't, you know what I mean? Now there is no. We stopped the Civil War because we were monitoring everything online through our IIA that we basically actually stirred up. But since we stirred it up, we were able to stop it, and so therefore we can create what Aquino calls the aristos or stabilization by basically policing speech, Okay, I mean it's basically, you want digital ID and social credit. Which way do you want to go? Do you want to go because you need a vaccine? Do you want it to go through carbon allotments? Do you want it to go because Russia's going to get us? Do you want it to go because the MAGA people? I mean, these are all different angles, but ultimately, in other words, it's the same outcome, right? I mean, regardless of how real it is, the point is like I just watched the other night, last night, the Vice documentary on the QAnon. They came up with a sequel to it. Well, basically has almost nothing to do with QAnon. It's all about how there's going to be a civil war, and this church group here and the My Pillow guy over here, where they're all insurrection. So in other words, they're stoking that idea, right? I mean, you hear it on mainstream media, you hear it in alt media, you hear a lot of people in alt media like, yeah, we gotta get ready. You got these, these PSYOP groups like Patriot Front and all this. I mean, I can see not just that narrative being spun, but I see a lot of efforts to, through like what Enrique Tarrio, the Fed, you know what I mean? Like there's government plants in these movements, these media operations are sort of creating the hype around it, and then the TV reinforces it. And so I hate to say it because this is the last thing I want in any way, shape, or form. But I'm seeing that narrative gaining more traction. Okay, and I'll just as one more aside. I know we disagree on the nature of the Constitution, and all that, but what we can say is this: look, before 2020, demonstrably we had some more rights that we ain't got now. All right, you know what I mean? And before 9/11 we did. So I mean there is some things in that Bill of Rights, whether or not even though they weren't always consistently upheld and stuff, like the language at least enabled some kind of a bulwark. So and again, and when you say right, when I say they want to bring in a new system, you're saying, well, it's just late stage capitalism or it's the next phase. Yeah, to me, it's semantic. I'm not disagreeing with that. But the point is, it needs to, mechanistically, it needs to be different. And some of the things in that Constitution might have people going, hey, don't I have rights? And they're like, those need to be out of the way because the algorithm is going to determine your rights, not the Bill of Rights. So.
And I want to say that I agree with that in the same way that we talked about how that 2012 Munt Act represents a progressive, aggressive advancement of their cause. It's like we're gonna actually put it in front of you that we're taking things away from you. So any degree to which they can put those things in place represents worse for us, better for them.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, Kenny?
And I think this is why it's a mistake to get stuck in vaccine mandates and think that this is just about those little things, like in like medical freedom, and it's much bigger than that. And I think that's the point we try to make on this show, that it's about humanity. It's about our humanity, and so I agree. It's the time for monsters, like Gramsci said once, and so couldn't agree more with both of you.
Yeah, and I think we're not going to get to, well, what do we do? Like, what is a person to do with all this white propaganda, gray propaganda, and black propaganda? How does one make sense when it penetrates all layers of information that we get? And I don't think you're saying that it all originates from that, but to know what is coming from directly the state and what is coming maybe indirectly and what is independent, that is a challenge. And so that's something I think we will have to pick up on our next episode. I'll have to check with Eduardo and Jessica.
And I'll just say one more thing about that, though, which is another layer to that is that because you have all three different forms of PSYOP propaganda, then and this leads into sort of what you're getting at as far as the solution, or at least this has to be factored in, is that one of the things that they want to happen as a result of overwhelming with all these different forms of propaganda is for you to not trust sources that that do have useful information, whether or not they might be propagandizing intentionally or otherwise, right? In other words, that it's not just to misinform you with the source, but it's to make it so that you won't look at certain sources and dig for the primary information, right? To cause more division and more mistrust as a result. Just as a side effect, basically. Yeah, go ahead.
Didn't the New York Times had some article related to don't do your own research?
Yeah, what's funny is, like NewsGuard and stuff like that. I think I read that the AFT was like promoting NewsGuard as like, for AFT, American Federation Team. Well, gee, I guess I better stop teaching English 102 then, because the whole class is about how to do your own research and make up your own mind and make a cogent argument based on primary sources. You know what I mean? Like, and there's a lot of people, I'm sure, that that teach that class and classes like that probably say, don't do your own research,
Right. Right. Well, I feel like we need to have a part 2 on this. So I'll have to check with Eduardo and Jessica, and see if they're willing to carry on with us maybe next week to get into, okay, what do we do? Jake, would you be able to come back next week if we could do it?
I should be able to. I don't see why not. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we still need to define other things too, right? like the other 2 words that you talked about.
Well, limited hangout and
yeah.
We didn't get too much into that, but okay, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, and I should just mention real quick. I mean, just as sort of a window into maybe our next discussion and sort of an example of maybe what to do is I mentioned that Millie Weaver documentary where I got information about the IIA, but I do not agree with the conclusions made or basically the Trumpian spin or some of the other things involved. In other words, like, I think that's a good example of how to use any information, right? Is to what can you source, all right, and then don't go with necessarily the broader context, right? Even a bad source can have some kernel of information that you can use, right? And so, anyways,
and I was actually recently talking to my partner or people in general about like sticking through the people that make your skin fucking crawl, like, and listening to people you completely fucking disagree with, and like you still learn something about that. You have to listen to what they're trying to say, not what it provokes in you.
Right. And even if the source is dubious, and you through your own primary documentary research, you have sort of like, okay, yeah, at the best, this person is very misguided. It's still a good use. It's a good use of information just to see what that angle is pushing from that paradigm, because all these different perspectives, right, as Aquino discusses, come to an aggregate that is trying to push the larger collective unidirectionally. So it's another vector to be aware of to see how it's going to affect other paradigms, other perspectives.
Well, you both cheated and tried to jump into the next episode. I won't edit this because I'm not going to say
it's a teaser for the next episode.
Okay, you're right. Yeah,
that's how you got to do that.
So you at home, think about what you think, because we're going to have more to say about all this stuff, and we may maybe we will define more limited hangout and
controlled opposition.
Controlled opposition.
We can maybe invite people to ask questions too, maybe for the next episode.
Yes. And if folks since I think we're going to try to do a part 2, if people have questions for us or for Jake to chew on next time, which I think is going to be more like, what do we do in the face of this stew of lies, half-truths, and, all sorts of just layers of deception, basically, that we live in. So please feel free to give us some questions that we can chew on for next week. Yeah, let's call it a day. Well, Jake, first of all, it's great to see you again. Great to have you back. Always a pleasure. Kenny, and of course, you're always here, so it's great. And we're looking forward to Eduardo and Jessica coming back. And I think we're going to be carrying on with this discussion next week. Okay, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. Post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes wherever you found this episode or on our blog, what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast on channels such as Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Bitchute, Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube, or Telegram. If you like anything that you've seen here, you please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of these 9 platforms. I think that's it. There's some other stuff that I can never remember. Anyway, thanks again, Jake, for being part of this episode, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Right on. Thanks a bunch.